A single dad draped his only warm jacket over a stranger shivering on a frozen highway. The next morning, the rumble of 100 motorcycles thundered down his quiet street, and everything he thought he knew about his life unraveled. Before we dive in, leave a comment and tell us where in the world you're watching from. And don't forget to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's story will blow your mind and warm your heart in ways you can't imagine. The night was sharp enough to cut through glass. Ben Carter gripped the steering wheel with bare hands, the heater in his old pickup coughing out more noise than warmth. A long day at the auto shop clung to him, the smell of oil on his jacket, the ache in his shoulders from hours under hoods and engines. The road stretched empty ahead, framed by skeletal trees and the heavy dark of a winter sky. Snow swirled in frantic circles, glinting against his headlights like torn paper caught in a restless wind. Home was still miles away. He thought of Lily, his 8-year-old daughter, asleep under the quilt she loved, crayons likely scattered across her pillow. That image was a soft pull toward warmth and quiet, the reason he worked late, the reason he kept driving, even when exhaustion pressed down like another layer of cold. Then he saw it, a flash of orange light pulsing weakly through the white curtain of snow. Hazard lights. Blinking like a heartbeat fading, he slowed, tires crunching on a thin glaze of ice, and made out the shape of a small car tilted slightly toward the shoulder. The figure standing beside it was almost swallowed by the storm. She hugged herself, head down, her coat no match for the night. Something in Ben tightened. He didn't think about schedules or the thin edge of his paycheck. He simply pulled over. The wind hit like a slap when he opened the door. His breath fogged instantly. He trudged through the snow until he was close enough for her to hear. "Everything okay, ma'am?" he called, voice low and steady. She turned, startled, eyes wide and pale in the dim light. Mid-30s maybe, with cheeks flushed from the cold and lips trembling so badly she could hardly form words. "My phone's dead," she stammered. "I called for a tow an hour ago." No one came. Her car idled weakly, headlights casting a feeble yellow arc on the snow. Ben glanced at the car, then at her shaking hands. "You can wait in my truck," he said gently. "It's not much, but it's warmer than this." She hesitated, then shook her head. "I don't want to leave the car." The refusal wasn't defiance, it was fear. Ben understood. Stranded at night, alone with a stranger, it was a hard thing to trust. He nodded. "Okay," he said simply. He didn't press. The cold was seeping fast into his own bones. His only thick jacket, a faded brown coat with a tear near the cuff, held the worst of it at bay. He looked at her again, shoulders hunched, breath shaky, and something inside him moved like instinct. Without a word, he unzipped the jacket and slid it off. The night air bit through his flannel shirt, sharp as knives. He stepped forward and draped the coat over her shoulders. She flinched at the sudden warmth, then pulled it tighter, eyes shining in the half-light. You don't have to." "I know, he said quietly, but you're freezing." For a moment they just stood there, the only sound the low hum of her engine and the endless whisper of snow against asphalt. Finally she said, "Claire." Her voice cracked like brittle wood. "Ben," he replied. That was all. 2 names, traded like a promise, neither of them quite understood. He stayed with her, feet planted in the snow, as minutes dragged into nearly an hour. He called the tow company on his own phone, pressing through static until someone finally confirmed they were on the way. The cold gnawed through his shirt, but he barely noticed. When the tow truck's headlights finally broke through the dark, Claire let out a breath that was half sob. Ben gave a small nod to the driver and stepped back. "You'll be okay now," he said. She clutched the jacket around her as if it were more than fabric. "How can I—" "Don't worry about it," he cut in gently. "Stay safe, that's all." Her eyes softened with something deeper than gratitude, something he couldn't name. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, as if words were too small for the moment. He only smiled, tipped his head, and walked back to his truck. The cab felt colder than before, his shirt damp with melted snow, but he didn't regret a thing. He glanced in the mirror once as he pulled away. The tow truck's lights painted the falling snow in gold and blue. Claire stood beside the driver, Ben's jacket wrapped around her like a shield, watching until his taillights disappeared. The rest of the drive passed in silence. Ben thought briefly about the cost of another winter coat and how long it might take to save for one. Then he thought of Lily, waiting in her dream world, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing he'd done the right thing. A small kindness on a desolate road, that was enough. He turned onto his street with a tired smile, unaware that this single choice, as simple and instinctive as breathing, had already set something vast and unstoppable in motion. Ben closed the front door behind him and stood for a moment in the small entryway, letting the silence of home settle over him. The old radiator hummed like a sleepy animal, pushing a faint warmth into the two-bedroom rental. He peeled off his damp flannel shirt and draped it over a chair near the heater, watching the steam rise from the fabric. The scent of snow and engine grease lingered in the air. For a long beat he just listened, to the creak of the house, to the soft tick of cooling pipes, to the distant sigh of wind against the windows. Down the hallway, Lily's door stood half open. Ben padded in quietly and found her slumped over her desk, head resting on a page of half-finished math problems. Crayons and paper were scattered like confetti across the floor. She had fallen asleep mid-thought, still in her school sweater. He lifted her gently, tucking her beneath the quilt she insisted on keeping, even in winter's coldest months. She murmured something in a dream, a faint giggle that softened the rough edges of his day. Ben brushed a strand of hair from her forehead and kissed her temple, a quiet ritual that steadied him more than any paycheck. In the kitchen, he set a kettle on the stove and leaned against the counter, waiting for the whistle. The house smelled faintly of vanilla from the candle Lily had lit earlier, but beneath it lingered a sharper memory, the bite of wind, the sight of snow swirling under a broken streetlight, the look in Claire's eyes. He saw her again as if she were standing in front of him, cheeks pale from the cold, lips trembling, eyes full of gratitude but shadowed by something heavier. It hadn't been just relief on her face. There was a depth there, a private ache she carried like an invisible weight. The kettle sang. Ben poured the water over a tea bag and wrapped his hands around the mug, savoring the heat. His coat, his only real winter shield, was gone, draped over a stranger miles away. The thought flickered in his mind, what if she never returned it? What if he couldn't afford another before the next storm? But the worry passed as quickly as it came. Some acts simply asked to be done. He hadn't stopped to calculate the cost when he saw her shivering. He just acted. To him, that was the point of decency. Help first. Figure out the rest later. Across town, another night unfolded differently. Claire sat on the edge of a hotel bed, Ben's jacket wrapped tight around her shoulders. The room was warm, but she couldn't let it go. The scent of motor oil and faint pine clung to the fabric, strangely comforting. Her phone lay silent beside her, its screen lit with unanswered messages, a trail of texts to her husband that had gone nowhere. Grant Ward was a man known for his influence, his wealth, and the way his moods could change like a shifting wind. Tonight, he hadn't answered at all. Claire's chest ached as she stared at those glowing blue bubbles. For years, she had lived surrounded by abundance, chauffeured cars, elegant dinners, a house that could swallow this entire hotel floor. Yet it was a stranger's quiet generosity, a coat offered without expectation, that cracked something open inside her. The simple act was more intimate than any lavish gift she'd received. In the cold of that roadside moment, she had felt truly seen for the first time in years. Tears streaked her cheeks as she pressed the jacket closer, as if it held a different kind of warmth, one that came from humanity rather than heat. She realized with a quiet shiver that this night, marked by a dead phone and a broken-down car, might end up changing more than her travel plans. It had already changed her heart. And though Ben Carter had driven away into the dark, with no thought of what might come next, his kindness now pulsed in a stranger's room like a hidden spark waiting to ignite something larger than either of them could yet imagine. The morning broke so still it felt like the world was holding its breath. Pale sunlight pushed weakly through the blinds, casting long stripes across the kitchen floor. Ben stood at the stove, flipping pancakes with the slow rhythm of a man easing into a quiet Saturday. The smell of butter and warm batter filled the room, mixing with the faint vanilla from last night's candle. For a moment it was the kind of peace he cherished. No deadlines, no phone calls, just him and Lily and the simple comfort of breakfast. Then came the sound. At first it was distant, a low grumble that might have been wind or a far-off storm. Ben paused, spatula midair, and tilted his head. The noise swelled, not a natural rumble, but something heavier, sharper. The windows quivered. Cups rattled softly in the cupboard like nervous teeth. Lily padded in, wearing her rainbow pajamas, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Is it thunder?" she asked. Ben listened harder. The sound deepened until he could hear individual throbs inside the roar, a mechanical heartbeat that didn't belong to the sky. "Not thunder," he murmured, a knot forming in his chest. The kettle on the counter shivered with each vibration. Outside, a dog began to bark, sharp and frantic. Another joined in, then another, until the whole neighborhood seemed to be waking with a low unease. Ben set the spatula down and wiped his palms on a towel. He crossed to the front door, drawn by an instinct he couldn't name. Lily followed close behind, her small hand clutching his. When he opened the door, the sound hit in full force. What he had thought was a storm was a tide of engines, dozens, no, hundreds, rising and falling like waves of steel. The air itself seemed to hum. From the far end of their narrow street, a line of motorcycles stretched into the distance, black and chrome gleaming under the pale sun. They came in a slow, synchronized formation, headlights flaring like a row of watchful eyes. Ben stepped onto the porch, the wooden boards vibrating under his boots. The cold morning air carried the scent of gasoline and leather, a raw edge of power. Neighbors peered through curtains and cracked doors, faces pale with curiosity and a flicker of fear. Children were lifted into arms. The usual quiet of their block had been replaced by the deep rolling thunder of machines that seemed to come from another world entirely. The convoy moved with uncanny precision, the roar of engines rising and falling in perfect unity until it felt almost like music, dark, commanding, impossible to ignore. At the center of the formation rode a single gleaming Harley, unlike any Ben had ever seen. Its metal polished to a mirror sheen that caught the weak sunlight and scattered it across the houses. The procession slowed as it neared his house, the lead riders signaling silently. One by one, engines settled into a steady growl, and then quieted, leaving behind an electric hush that made the hairs on Ben's arms stand up. 100 motorcycles now lined the street like a wall of chrome and muscle, each rider sitting upright and motionless, leather jackets creaking softly as they turned to face his porch. Ben felt Lily press closer, her breath quick against his side. "Dad, what is that?" she whispered, eyes wide as coins. He couldn't answer. Words felt too small for the sight before him. From the heart of the formation, the man on the custom Harley dismounted. He moved with calm authority, unhurried but unmistakably certain, each step deliberate on the frosted pavement. He pulled off his helmet, and a head of silver-streaked hair caught the light. His face was strong and composed, lined with experience, but not hardened. Fierce and calm all at once, like someone who had weathered many storms and learned to master them. For a long breath he simply looked at Ben. No greeting, no demand, just a steady gaze that seemed to weigh and measure without judgment. Then, with the quiet of someone who owned the moment entirely, he started up the driveway, the silence of 100 watching riders closing in behind him like a held breath waiting to be released. The man's boots crunched on the frosted driveway, each step carrying an authority that made the air feel heavier. Ben stayed on the porch, one arm instinctively around Lily, as the stranger approached. The street was silent, except for the low, synchronized purr of 100 idling engines. Neighbors stayed hidden behind curtains, faces half lit in the morning sun, sensing that something beyond ordinary courtesy was unfolding. The man stopped at the foot of the porch and looked up. His eyes were a hard, clear gray, the kind that didn't need to raise a voice to be heard. "I'm Grant Ward," he said, his voice deep and deliberate, the kind that could fill a stadium or calm a restless crowd. "Claire's husband. Leader of the Iron Brotherhood." He didn't add explanations about who they were. The title and the presence of the motorcycle spoke louder than any resume. "You met her last night." Ben swallowed, throat dry. He nodded slowly. "She was stranded. I just helped." Grant's gaze softened, but only slightly. "You gave her your jacket." "Stayed until help came. You didn't know her name or what she carries in this world. You just stopped. That matters to us." The words hung in the cold morning air, heavier than the exhaust curling skyward. Behind him, the riders sat as still as statues, their silence amplifying every heartbeat. Ben shifted, unsure whether to feel honored or alarmed. His jacket had been a reflex, not a plan. He'd done what anyone decent would do. It was nothing," he said, though the words felt too small. Grant's expression flickered with something unreadable, respect maybe, threaded with a hint of gratitude that didn't quite reach a smile. "It wasn't nothing. Claire called me in tears last night, told me about the stranger who kept her safe. I've built a life on loyalty and strength, on people showing up when it counts. What you did hit me deeper than 1,000 speeches about courage." Lily peeked around Ben's side, eyes wide, taking in the sea of chrome and leather and the silver-haired man who seemed to carry the weight of an army. Grant noticed her and lowered his voice, gentle but still commanding. "Your dad did something brave," he said, meeting her eyes. "That bravery deserves to be met with gratitude." Ben exhaled, the cold burning his lungs. "You didn't have to come all this way," he said quietly. "We did," Grant replied. "My brothers and I protect those who protect our own. When someone shows kindness without a reason, we show up. It's how we live." He gestured slightly toward the silent convoy, and a ripple of subtle nods passed through the riders, a living confirmation of his words. Something in Ben loosened. He realized this wasn't intimidation. It was a declaration, a code. These men and women weren't here to frighten him. They were here to honor something rare. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of gasoline and cold iron. Ben hesitated, then stepped back from the doorway. "Would you like to come in? Warm up?" The invitation surprised even him, but it felt right. Grant inclined his head, a small but deliberate sign of acceptance. He climbed the porch steps with quiet steadiness, the leather of his jacket creaking softly. Lily stepped aside, still staring, as Ben held the door open. Inside, the house smelled of pancakes and tea, ordinary and warm against the winter chill. As Grant crossed the threshold, the rumble of engines outside lowered to a patient idle, as if the entire brotherhood understood this was more than a visit. Ben closed the door, heart still racing, wondering how a simple act of roadside kindness had summoned an army of strangers and a man whose steel-gray gaze carried the weight of a promise that might change everything. The kitchen felt smaller with Grant Ward seated at the table, his leather jacket carrying the faint smell of engine oil and winter roads. The coffee pot hissed softly on the counter, releasing a rich aroma that wove through the air like a quiet bridge between two men who, only hours ago, were strangers. Ben poured 2 mugs and slid one across the table. His hands trembled slightly, though whether from nerves or the cold he couldn't tell. Lily lingered in the hallway, half-hidden, wide-eyed, as if watching a scene from a story she didn't yet understand. For a few moments they sipped in silence, the hum of the old refrigerator filling the space between words. Grant's silver-streaked hair caught the kitchen's weak light, his eyes steady, but softened by something deeper, than the reputation of a motorcycle brotherhood leader. "She told me everything," he finally said, voice low and deliberate. "About the cold. About you giving up your coat without a question. About how you stayed until help came. You should know, in my world, actions like that don't go unnoticed." Ben managed a quiet nod. "I didn't think about it," he said. "She needed help. That was enough." Grant leaned back, the leather of his jacket creaking like an old saddle. "That's exactly what struck me. I've spent years around people who measure everything: status, money, power. But I ride with brothers and sisters who know a different currency: loyalty, sacrifice, showing up when it counts. I used to think I understood all that until war changed me. After I came home, I carried ghosts that no speech or paycheck could quiet. Long rides saved me, hours on the road with nothing but engine noise and open sky. That's where I learned that loyalty isn't spoken, it's lived." The confession settled into the room like the scent of coffee itself, warm, grounding, unexpectedly human. Ben wrapped his fingers tighter around his mug. The words stirred something he usually kept locked away. "I know a little about ghosts," he said softly. "My wife, she died suddenly 3 years ago. An infection no one caught in time. One day she was laughing over Lily's school project. 2 days later I was signing papers I didn't understand. It still feels like I wake up in that hospital hallway sometimes. Since then it's been work, bills, and trying to be both mom and dad. Some days I don't know if I'm doing either well." Grant didn't flinch or rush to fill the silence. He simply listened, the way a man who's carried his own grief knows to listen. "You're still standing," he said at last. "That's not failure. That's fight." Ben felt an unexpected steadiness in those words, as if someone had lifted a weight from the center of his chest. He studied the man across from him and realized how little the surface explained. Behind the steel gaze was someone who understood loss not as an idea, but as a landscape he'd walked for miles. Minutes stretched and softened. Lily crept closer, curiosity outweighing her shyness, until she perched on the chair beside her father. Grant gave her a small nod, a silent greeting that held no trace of intimidation. The kitchen seemed to breathe easier, warmed by more than coffee. Then Grant set his cup down and rested a heavy, ringed hand on the table. His voice dropped into a tone that felt like a promise etched in stone. "From this day forward," he said, "you and your little girl ride under our protection. Whatever comes, storms, trouble, anything, you are not alone." The words landed like a quiet benediction, filling the room with a certainty that outshone the winter light. Ben felt something shift deep inside, a recognition that the line between stranger and family had been crossed in the simplest, most irrevocable way. He looked at Grant, at Lily's small hand resting on his, en amours, and knew that the night of the jacket had already rewritten their lives in ways they were only beginning to understand. The knock came soft but sure, cutting through the murmur of conversation and the clink of mugs. Ben rose from the table, heart still steady from the promise Grant had laid across it moments before. When he opened the door, a rush of cold air followed Claire inside. She paused on the threshold, eyes widening as she took in the sight of leather-clad riders crowded into the modest kitchen, steam from their coffee fogging the small window panes. For a second she simply stood there, breath caught, like someone stepping into a scene she hadn't known she needed to witness. In her arms she carried Ben's jacket, freshly cleaned, and folded with careful precision. But it wasn't the tidy folds that struck him. It was the way she held it close, as if it were something fragile and holy. She stepped forward, voice trembling. "I don't think I can give this back," she said. "It feels like more than a coat now." Ben shook his head gently, a small smile forming. "You have to," he replied. "It was never meant to be anything but a jacket keeping you warm. That's all I wanted, to help, no debt." Her hands tightened on the fabric. "That's just it," she said. tears rising as if they'd been waiting for this moment. For years I've been surrounded by wealth, houses with too many rooms, people with perfect manners, a calendar filled with everything but meaning, and I was so alone I didn't even know how lonely I'd become. That night on the roadside, it was the first time in years I felt like someone saw me. Not the name, not the connections, just me, cold and scared and human. Your kindness. It broke something open I didn't realize was locked. The room fell into a soft hush. Even the riders, who had been trading quiet jokes a moment ago, listened with heads slightly bowed. Grant stood near the counter, his broad frame still but not rigid. As he watched his wife speak, something flickered across his face. Pride, yes, but also a shadow of pain. He had built a life around the strength of his brotherhood, long miles on open roads, the power of being needed and followed. But in Claire's trembling voice, he heard an echo of the tenderness he had once promised her and allowed time and distance to thin. He stepped closer, resting a steadying hand on her shoulder. "Claire," he said softly, almost reverently. She turned toward him, and for a heartbeat they simply looked at each other, the noise of the room falling away. It was as if the jacket between them wasn't just fabric, but a bridge. Back to vows, whispered years ago, back to the kind of care that leadership and late-night rides had let slip. Ben reached out and touched the folded coat, his fingers brushing hers. "Take it back into your life," he said, voice low but certain, "but not as a burden. As a reminder that simple things still matter. That's all I meant to give." Claire drew in a shaky breath and nodded. She placed the jacket carefully on the table, but not as if relinquishing it, as if consecrating it. Around them the riders seemed to sense the weight of the moment. No one spoke. The smell of coffee and winter leather wrapped the room in a quiet warmth. Grant finally exhaled, a long sound that held both release and renewal. He looked at Ben with eyes less like steel and more like sky after a storm. "This coat," he said, "has carried more than cold away. It's brought something back to us." The jacket lay there between them, just cloth and stitching, yet more than either. It had become a symbol of promises remembered, of hearts reawakened, of how a single act of decency could repair things no wealth or power could touch. And as Claire rested her hand over her husband's, Ben felt the quiet truth settle over the room like a blessing. Sometimes the smallest kindness carries a lifetime of meaning. By noon, the quiet street no longer felt like the street Ben had known for years. What began as a silent arrival of roaring engines had softened into something almost celebratory. The line of motorcycles gleamed under the thin winter sun, chrome catching flashes of light that bounced across the clapboard houses. Children who had been peeking nervously through curtains now edged closer in puffy coats and bright hats, drawn by the strange beauty of so many machines lined up like a living sculpture. The riders, sensing the shift, opened their thermoses and began handing out cups of hot cocoa, steam curling into the cold air like friendly smoke signals. Ben watched as the first brave child reached out to touch a polished handlebar, then climbed into a seat with the help of a laughing biker who introduced herself as Sky from North Carolina. That was all it took. Soon more children poured onto the sidewalks, their boots crunching on the salted pavement. Riders lifted them onto seats, explained how throttles worked, and let them lean against tanks that rumbled faintly as if the bikes themselves approved of the attention. What had started as an intimidating spectacle was turning into something joyous. Parents followed more slowly, exchanging cautious glances that softened into curiosity. A woman from 2 houses down approached with a thermos of her own, offering it to one of the riders and asking where he'd traveled from. He pointed to a patch on his vest stitched with Oregon, and suddenly the conversation widened into stories of open highways and small towns with names like songs. Ben's neighbors, who for years had nodded politely before retreating inside, now lingered on the curb, swapping tales about road trips, favorite diners, and even family memories stirred by the scent of leather and coffee. The air filled with laughter and the kind of overlapping conversations that only happen when strangers decide they might as well be friends. Someone brought out a portable speaker, and soft blues drifted over the block, blending with the low murmur of idling engines. A retired schoolteacher pulled a folding chair onto her porch and clapped in time to the music. The cold seemed to recede, as though the collective warmth of voices and cocoa had tilted the weather itself. Ben stood near his porch steps, Lily beside him, and let it all soak in. For years he had lived on the street feeling invisible, waving politely, but rarely exchanging more than a few words with neighbors who disappeared behind their doors. Now those same doors stood open, the smell of baking bread and fresh coffee slipping out to mingle with the scent of gasoline and winter air. He caught sight of a man he barely knew from the corner house helping a biker adjust a sidecar for a group of kids eager for a photo. Across the yard, two elderly neighbors who hadn't spoken in months laughed together over a shared cup of cocoa. Grant wandered over, hands in his jacket pockets, the silver streaks in his hair bright against the pale sky. He paused to watch Lily sitting cross-legged on the sidewalk, sharing her crayons with a young writer's daughter who was sketching a motorcycle with surprising accuracy. A soft smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "Kindness doesn't just save people," he said quietly to Ben. "It wakes up entire places." Ben nodded, feeling the truth of it settle deep. What he had done the night before, just a coat, just a choice to stop, had rippled outward in ways he could never have planned. A neighborhood that once felt cold and self-contained now pulsed with life, as if some long-forgotten spirit of community had been waiting for this exact spark. Standing there in the winter light, Ben realized he was no longer just a quiet mechanic trying to get through the week. He was part of something bigger, the center of a gathering that felt like a long-lost family finally coming back to life. The winter sun sagged toward the rooftops, painting the sky in streaks of bruised purple and gold. Engines coughed and settled into softer idles as the riders began to pack up, voices low and warm with the kind of goodbyes that promised return. Children clutched leftover cups of cocoa like trophies, and neighbors lingered on their porches longer than they had in years, reluctant to let the day end. From his front steps, Ben watched it all with a strange mix of awe and fatigue. What had begun as a morning of pancakes had turned into something he couldn't name. Community, miracle, maybe both. And yet, as the laughter and engine noise blurred into dusk, a heavier current tugged beneath the wonder, a weight he had carried so long it felt like part of his own spine. He stepped onto the porch and leaned against the railing, the wood cool under his hands. The yard lights flickered on, casting a pale glow over the street that still vibrated faintly with the echo of engines. Grant appeared beside him without a sound, the leather of his jacket creaking just enough to announce his presence. For a moment they stood side by side, silent, watching riders adjust helmets and tighten straps. Grant's steady gaze seemed to sense everything Ben couldn't put into words. "You look like a man with more on his mind than a good day," Grant said quietly. Ben let out a small, humorless laugh. "Good day," he echoed, tasting the words. Then, surprising even himself, he began to speak. The confessions spilled out in a low, even voice, shaped by years of restraint. He told Grant about the hospital bills that still came like ghosts every month, the medical debt that had outlived his wife. About the nights he'd lain awake, staring at the ceiling and wondering how long he could keep the house before the numbers finally broke him. About the endless tightrope of raising Lily alone, trying to be both gentle and strong, mother and father, never certain if he was enough of either. "I keep it together for her," he said, eyes fixed on the dim horizon. "But there are days when I wonder how much longer I can keep pretending." The last word landed heavier than he expected. Grant didn't interrupt. He didn't offer quick fixes or soft assurances. He simply listened, the quiet between them expanding like a safe room. When Ben finally fell silent, it was Grant who exhaled first, a long breath that carried its own story. "I know that road," he said, voice low and steady. "After my service, I came home to nothing that felt like home. Lost friends. I still see in dreams. For years I rode just to outrun the noise in my head. There were nights when speed was the only thing that made the world quiet. I thought if I rode far enough, I might leave the grief behind. Turns out, it rides with you until you learn to stop and face it." The porch light hummed above them. A gust of wind stirred the scent of leather and gasoline, mixing with the faint sweetness of cocoa still hanging in the air. Two men from different worlds, one hardened by war and asphalt, the other by hospital corridors and single-parent nights, stood in the same silence and recognized the same scars. Pain, they understood, wears the same face, whether wrapped in black leather or faded work boots. Grant turned and gripped Ben's shoulder, firm and certain. "What you did for Claire wasn't small," he said. "It was brave. And sometimes bravery needs backup." The words slid past Ben's defenses, anchoring somewhere deeper than reassurance. He drew in a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, the air filling spaces that had felt empty for years. The street still buzzed faintly with the Brotherhood's presence, but inside him something quieter shifted. For the first time since loss rewrote his life, he didn't feel like he was carrying the weight alone. The last light of afternoon slid across the quiet street, gilding the chrome of the waiting bikes until they gleamed like molten silver. Riders stood in small knots, finishing their goodbyes, engines pulsing in a steady heartbeat that filled the cold air. Ben lingered on the porch beside Grant, still carrying the quiet relief of their earlier conversation. He thought the day's surprises were done. Then Grant turned toward him with a look that hinted otherwise. "Before we roll out," Grant said, voice carrying easily over the low rumble, "I have a thought. Next weekend we're riding a charity route, long open roads, stops at children's hospitals, music and food along the way. I'd like you and Lily to join us." For a moment Ben only blinked. The words didn't quite land. A ride? His life was built on steady ground. The shop, school schedules, quiet nights. Adventure belonged to other people. "I don't know," he began carefully. "I'm not exactly built for that kind of trip." Before he could say more, Lily bounded forward from the hallway where she'd been listening, her face bright with wonder. "Did you say ride?" she asked, the question tumbling out like a spark. Grant crouched to meet her eyes, the leather of his jacket creaking softly. "That's right," he said, with a smile that warmed the whole porch. "We have helmets just your size. You could ride beside your dad, feel the wind, help us bring gifts to kids who need them." Lily gasped and turned to Ben, her small hands clasped in sudden hope. "Can we, Dad? Please, just one time?" Ben looked at her, the excitement dancing in her eyes like sunlight on water, and something inside him shifted. For years he had chosen the predictable path: work late, pay bills, keep everything safe and small. It was the way he'd managed grief and fear, building a world where nothing unexpected could hurt them. But standing there with the echo of engines and the scent of leather and cocoa still in the air, he felt that armor loosen. Maybe the safest life wasn't always the smallest one. He exhaled, the breath visible in the cooling dusk. "One ride," he said finally, his voice both cautious and full of something new. "We can try one ride." Lily squealed and hugged him, the pure joy of it ringing louder than the motorcycles. Grant rose with a grin that reached his eyes. "That's all we ask," he said. "One ride is enough to feel the road under your heart. After that, you decide if there's a second." The riders around them nodded, as if they'd heard every word, a silent circle of approval. Engines revved in unison, not impatient but celebratory, like a deep chord struck across the gathering. Ben tightened his arm around Lily, sensing the quiet promise hidden in the invitation. It wasn't about speed or spectacle. It was about motion after years of standing still, about finding a way to carry grief forward instead of letting it root in place. As the convoy finally eased into motion, headlights sweeping across the houses, the sound deepened into a magnificent roar. Tires left faint black arcs on the street, signatures of loyalty and welcome. Lily waved until the last taillight disappeared into the violet dusk, cheeks flushed from more than the cold. Ben remained on the porch long after silence returned, the night air cool on his face, a small seed of anticipation taking root in his chest. The ride was a week away, but already it felt like a door opening to something wider than the life he'd been protecting. For the first time in years, the future didn't look like a narrow hallway of bills and long shifts. It looked like a road stretching outward, carrying healing and freedom side by side. Saturday morning dawned clear and sharp, the kind of autumn light that makes everything look freshly washed. Ben stepped outside with a nervous breath and found the street alive with sound. Rows of motorcycles waited like patient animals, sunlight flashing off chrome. Grant waved from the center of the lineup, already strapping a small sidecar onto his bike. "For Lily," he called, the words rolling easily over the low thunder of engines. Ben helped Lily into her puffy jacket, while Grant's crew produced a helmet in her size, bright blue with tiny stars painted across the sides. Another rider handed Ben a matte black helmet that felt heavier than he expected, solid and reassuring. As he tightened the strap under his chin, he caught his reflection in a bike's polished fender and hardly recognized the man staring back, cautious but grinning, shoulders lighter than they had been in years. When Grant finally signaled the start, the street erupted into motion. The roar of engines that had once sounded like distant thunder now pulsed through Ben's chest like a living heartbeat. The vibration under his boots, the rush of cold air against his neck, it all folded into a rhythm that felt strangely natural. Lily squealed from the sidecar, waving to neighbors who came out early just to watch them go. They left the city streets behind and followed winding country roads lined with bare trees and the occasional burst of late-season leaves. Ben hadn't known how wide the world could feel at 50 miles an hour. Hills rose and fell like slow breathing, fields spread out in a patchwork of gold and green, and the horizon stretched so far it seemed to erase the walls he'd built around his life. With every curve of the road, years of quiet struggle loosened their grip. A mortgage payment that never stopped worrying him, the silent nights after his wife's passing, the constant calculation of what might break next. The noise of grief that had lived in his chest began to dissolve into the steady music of the ride. Lily's laughter carried on the wind, light and fearless. She waved at passing cars, grinning so wide her cheeks must have hurt. Other riders responded with honks and waves, a spontaneous communion between strangers. Ben found himself laughing too, a sound he hadn't heard from his own throat in a long while, at once surprised and relieved by its ease. Hours later, the convoy slowed at the gates of a children's hospital painted with murals of animals and bright skies. Volunteers emerged to meet them, eyes lighting up at the sight of the towering bikes and the boxes of supplies strapped to their backs. The riders dismounted and instantly transformed. Men and women who minutes ago looked carved from iron now knelt on soft hospital mats to color with children, or pulled out guitars for impromptu sing-alongs. One rider fashioned balloon animals with thick, tattooed hands. Another read aloud from a stack of storybooks, his gravelly voice soft enough to soothe a fussy toddler. The contrast was stunning and beautiful, strength bending into gentleness without hesitation. Grant caught Ben's expression and smiled. "Many of us are veterans," he explained quietly. "Some grew up in foster care. We found family out here on the road. This is where the noise finally makes sense." Ben took it in, the laughter bouncing off sterile hallways, the way Lily sat cross-legged with a group of children as if she'd known them forever. Something in him recognized this wasn't just charity, it was redemption, a daily choosing of life over despair. As dusk approached and the riders prepared to head home, Ben climbed back into the sidecar beside Lily. The ride back felt different. The road wasn't just open, it was alive, a long ribbon of possibility unwinding beneath them. He realized the journey had never really been about motorcycles. It was about motion after years of standing still, about remembering that joy could still be loud and unashamed, about the quiet miracle of feeling his heart keep time with the world again. The Monday after the ride, Ben returned to his usual routine, expecting little more than sore muscles and a heart full of new memories. Instead, his phone buzzed relentlessly from the moment he opened his eyes. Friends from the auto shop sent screenshots of news feeds filled with images he barely recognized at first. Lily in her bright blue helmet, her arms outstretched in mid-wave. Ben caught mid-laugh between Claire and Grant. Children at the hospital hugging leather-jacketed riders who looked like gentle giants. A local photographer had followed the convoy, and now the story had slipped the bounds of their quiet town and sprinted across the internet. By midweek, the images were everywhere. The neighborhood newspaper ran a headline that made Ben blush. The quiet hero with a borrowed jacket. Regional stations picked it up, then national blogs. Comments flooded in, strangers marveling at the simple kindness of a man who had given his only warm coat to a stranger and unwittingly sparked a charity ride that was still gaining momentum. Some messages were short, just thank yous, sent from kitchen tables across the country. Others came with donations, big and small, directed to the children's hospital they had visited. The hospital itself announced a surge of gifts so sudden they called it the Jacket Wave. At the shop, even Ben's boss, a man known more for complaints than compliments, pulled him aside. "You're making us look good," he said with an awkward half-smile. Then he did something rarer than praise. He offered Ben extra paid leave to keep up the community work. "Take the time," he insisted. "What you're doing out there matters more than brake pads." Ben accepted with quiet gratitude, thinking how strange and beautiful it was that a night of cold and chance now rippled into warm hours he could spend with Lily. Yet, as the attention swelled, Ben stayed grounded. He sat with Lily at the kitchen table one evening, the glow of a tablet reflecting off her eager face as she scrolled through articles about their adventure. "We're famous," she whispered, half thrilled, half unsure. Ben covered her small hand with his calloused one. "Remember," he said gently, "this isn't about being known. It's about being kind. Headlines fade. Kindness keeps working even when no one's watching." She nodded, eyes thoughtful, and set the tablet aside to draw another picture of her favorite motorcycle from the ride. Across town, Grant and Claire faced their own flood of messages. Hundreds of emails and calls from families, riding clubs, and community groups who had seen the story and wanted to start their own charity convoys. Claire read many aloud, pausing to wipe away tears when parents explained how they planned to honor lost loved ones by helping children's hospitals. Grant listened with quiet pride, the hardened lines of his face softening as he realized that the loyalty and courage he had long cultivated on the road were now sparking a different kind of brotherhood, one built on generosity instead of just grit. For Ben, the days blurred into a gentle, almost surreal rhythm. Morning coffee with Lily. A few hours at the shop. Afternoons answering letters from strangers who sent everything from heartfelt notes to handmade scarves and miniature bike models. Each envelope carried a reminder that a single, unplanned gesture on a freezing night could carry farther than anyone could predict. What had begun as a private act of decency now reached into living rooms and hospital wards across the region, rewriting how people thought about generosity and community. One quiet evening he stood on the porch reading a letter from a family in another state who had just organized their first ride for a children's clinic. The air smelled of wood smoke and the last of autumn leaves. He thought of the jacket, of the roadside night, of the convoy that had thundered down his street and left something behind more lasting than noise. Quiet courage, he realized, can echo louder than any headline, and its sound carries best when it starts with the simplest act of kindness. A light snowfall drifted across the quiet street as dusk settled, turning the air soft and silver. From the garage came the sound of laughter and clinking bulbs. Grant and Lily stringing lights for the charity event they'd been planning all week. Their voices carried like music, bright against the hush of winter. Ben stepped outside to check on them and found Claire waiting near the sidewalk, her breath a pale cloud in the fading light. She met his eyes with a small, almost hesitant smile. "Would you walk with me for a bit?" she asked. They set off toward the nearby park, boots crunching through a thin crust of snow. The neighborhood behind them quieted until only the faint hum of distant traffic and the occasional bark of a dog remained. For a while they walked without speaking, the silence not awkward but heavy with something unsaid. Street lamps pooled light on the path, turning each step into a brief circle of gold before they moved back into shadow. Finally, Claire exhaled a breath that seemed to have waited days to leave. "The night you found me," she began, her voice low enough that the words felt private to the cold air, "it wasn't just a dead phone or a broken car. I wasn't really stranded." She paused, eyes on the dark trees ahead. "I was running." Ben kept his gaze on the path, giving her space. She continued, words gaining a quiet momentum. "I'd been drowning in work, expectations, this life that looked perfect from the outside but left no room to breathe. Grant and I, we were talking less, traveling in different directions, even when we were in the same room. That night, I just got in the car and drove. No plan, no destination. I thought maybe if I kept moving, I could outrun the noise in my own head." She gave a soft, almost rueful laugh. "Then the cold forced me to stop." The memory sharpened in her voice, how the cold bit at her skin, how the night sky pressed down. "When you appeared with that coat," she said, "it wasn't just warmth you offered." It was recognition. "You looked at me like a person, not a problem to be fixed or a responsibility to manage." In that moment, I felt more seen than I had in years. Ben listened without interrupting, the rhythm of their steps steady as a heartbeat. He knew something about running from grief, about long drives meant to escape a silence that only grew louder. Claire wiped at a tear that froze almost instantly on her glove. "I've sat through therapy sessions, corporate retreats, all the things people say will change your perspective. None of them cracked me open the way a stranger's quiet kindness did. You reminded me of the kind of love that doesn't keep score, the kind that simply shows up." They reached a small footbridge where the stream below had begun to freeze, the water whispering beneath thin ice. Ben rested his hands on the railing and finally spoke. "Kindness isn't a debt," he said gently. "It doesn't need to be repaid. Sometimes it's just what we do for each other because we can." Claire turned to him, her face luminous in the cold moonlight. "Still," she whispered, voice thick with emotion, "I think you saved more than one life that night." They stood for a while longer, listening to the faint trickle of water and the far-off echo of laughter from the garage. Snowflakes landed soundlessly on their coats. Ben felt the weight of her words settle into the quiet, not as a burden but as something sacred. What began as a simple act on a frozen roadside had become a turning point, a reminder that even the smallest, most uncalculated gestures can reach into hidden corners of another person's life and bring them back to themselves. The late afternoon light slanted through the open garage door, throwing long stripes across the concrete floor where a half-finished oil change waited. Ben wiped his hands on a rag, expecting nothing more than another quiet evening of small repairs and the familiar scent of grease. The sound of a motorcycle pulling up broke the stillness, low and steady. When the engine cut, the silence felt purposeful, almost expectant. Grant stepped inside, helmet under one arm, the cold, riding air still clinging to his jacket. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I've got something I want to run by you," he said, his voice carrying that calm weight Ben had come to know. "It might sound big, but hear me out." They sat on two stools near the workbench, the smell of gasoline mingling with the faint sweetness of the apple pie Lily and a neighbor had baked earlier. Grant rested his helmet on the floor and leaned forward. "We've been watching what you've built since that first ride," he began. "The community events, the way people rally around you, it's something rare. We want you to become the official community coordinator for our national riding network. You'd oversee charity routes, organize local outreach, help connect riders to causes. There's a salary, and the hours are flexible. You'd have more time with Lily, less of the night shifts that keep you here until dawn." Ben blinked, caught off guard. For years his life had been about staying afloat. Work, home, sleep, repeat. The idea of a job built around connection and service felt almost unreal. "I don't know," he said slowly. "I've never led anything like that. I fix engines, I make sure my kids' homework is done. That's about it." Grant's steady gaze didn't waver. He reached out and placed a solid ringed hand on Ben's shoulder. "You already lead," he said simply. "You just don't call it that. Look at what's happened since you offered a stranger your jacket. You turned a single act of kindness into a movement that's reached across states. That's leadership, whether you name it or not." The words settled in the air, quiet and unarguable. Ben stared at the concrete floor, tracing the outline of an oil stain, while thoughts tangled and unraveled inside him. Could he really step into something so visible, so dependent on him? Responsibility had always felt heavy. But then he pictured Lily's face on the sidecar ride, eyes bright and fearless, and remembered how the neighborhood had awakened around the motorcycles and hot cocoa. Maybe leadership wasn't about control. Maybe it was about making room for moments like those to happen again and again. Later that night, after Grant had ridden off and the garage door was pulled shut, Ben sat at the kitchen table with Lily. The soft hum of the refrigerator filled the space between their words. He explained the offer as plainly as he could. Less time under hoods late at night, more time for rides and community work, a chance to build something that mattered beyond their own walls. Lily's response was immediate and radiant. "That means we could help more kids like at the hospital?" she asked, leaning forward with both hands on the table. "And ride together more?" Ben nodded, and her smile widened until it felt like another lamp in the room. "Then say yes, Dad," she said. "That sounds like what you're already doing, just bigger." Her certainty pierced through the last of his doubt. In that moment he understood that this wasn't about ambition or a title. It was about stepping into the life that had already begun to form around them the night he stopped on that frozen road. When he finally called Grant to accept, the decision felt less like a leap and more like a road revealing itself, clear and open. The man who once moved through life invisible now saw a path lined not with endless obligations but with possibility, each mile a chance to serve, to connect, and to keep the quiet miracle of that first act of kindness alive. Winter softened into a mild spring, and what began as a single charity ride unfurled into something larger than anyone had imagined. Under Ben's steady guidance, the monthly motorcycle meetups became neighborhood rituals. The roar of engines that once startled the block now announced celebration, a festival of food drives, music, and free mechanic workshops that welcomed everyone. Riders arrived from distant states carrying bags of donated groceries and boxes of toys. Parents came with strollers and folding chairs, drawn by the smell of barbecue and the promise of shared company. The garage that had once been a quiet workspace transformed into a hub of motion and laughter, its open doors spilling warmth and music into the street. On festival nights, long tables lined the sidewalks. Children darted between them with sticky fingers and painted faces. Volunteers ladled steaming soup and handed out bread, while musicians played blues and folk on makeshift stages lit by string lights. A group of riders offered free tune-ups for single parents, bending over hoods and bicycles with the same care they once reserved for their own machines. Ben moved among them with quiet ease, answering questions, sharing tools, and listening to stories of families who had never before found reason to gather here. When dusk settled, the heart of the evening always shifted toward the bonfire. Neighbors who once barely exchanged nods now sat shoulder to shoulder, passing mugs of cocoa and swapping stories under a sky bright with stars. The flames snapped and sent sparks curling upward, like tiny declarations of how far they'd come. From his spot near the fire, Ben often watched Lily teaching younger kids how to roast marshmallows, her small hands steady as she helped them turn skewers just right. There was a quiet pride in that sight that went deeper than any paycheck he had ever earned, a certainty that he was giving his daughter more than safety and shelter. He was giving her belonging. Grant noticed, too. One evening he sat beside Ben, firelight catching the silver in his hair. "You realize this doesn't feel like an organization anymore," he said with a soft grin. "It's a living, breathing family, and you built the heart of it." Ben shook his head, but Grant's look held gentle insistence. "Leadership isn't about titles," he added. "It's about what grows around you when you keep showing up." Claire brought her own quiet artistry to the movement. Armed with brushes and bold colors, she turned the garage's blank walls into a series of murals that told their shared story. One panel showed a single jacket draped over a woman in the snow, another a convoy of motorcycles beneath a sky streaked with dawn. Children helped with the finishing touches, adding handprints and bright stars until the concrete itself seemed to glow. The murals became more than decoration. They were living memories, visible proof that a frozen night had blossomed into a season of connection. As the months passed, the block changed in ways no city planner could have drawn. Windows once shuttered now stayed open to catch music and laughter. Neighbors started their own small projects, community gardens, book swaps, after-school tutoring, each sparked by the spirit that flowed from the garage and the rides. Travelers began stopping by just to see the place where a simple act of kindness had bloomed into a movement. On evenings when the fire burned low and conversation settled into comfortable silence, Ben sometimes leaned back and took in the scene. Children chasing embers, Grant and Claire laughing with neighbors, riders sharing stories with people who had once been strangers. The air smelled of wood smoke and roasted sugar. He felt a deep stillness, a knowing that all of this, every spark and every smile, had grown from one quiet decision on a winter road to offer warmth to someone who needed it. What had started as a single act of compassion had rebuilt not just lives, but an entire community, turning an ordinary block into a landmark of welcome and belonging. The first warning arrived folded into an unmarked envelope. Ben found it wedged between the day's mail, a single sheet of paper that smelled faintly of printer ink and cold air. No greeting, just a clipped message typed in bold black letters. Noise complaints and zoning violations will not be tolerated. Cease public gatherings or face legal action. There was no signature, only a P.O. box address and a logo, faintly embossed at the bottom from a well-known development company. At first he thought it might be a mistake, but over the next week, 2 more letters appeared, each sharper than the last. One hinted at upcoming city council review of residential use. Another threatened unavoidable legal consequences. The language was dry, but the intent was unmistakable. Someone with resources wanted their neighborhood back behind closed doors. Ben felt the old anxiety seep in like a draft. He'd worked so hard to keep life stable for Lily, steady paychecks, quiet evenings, a home that felt safe. Now memories of hospital bills and sleepless nights returned, carrying the same ache in his chest. He pictured lawyers' fees, city hearings, the possibility of losing everything they had built in the very place where they'd finally found joy. It felt cruel that a miracle born from kindness could be reduced to noise complaints on a form. Grant heard the worry in Ben's voice over the phone and arrived that night with 6 key riders. They gathered in the garage after dark, the smell of engine oil mixing with the sweetness of wood smoke from a neighbor's stove. A single work light hung from a beam, casting sharp shadows across the murals Claire had painted, bright proof of all they had accomplished. Grant leaned on the workbench, arms folded. "This isn't the first time someone's tried to buy silence," he said, his voice steady and low, but they're underestimating what's been built here. He looked around the circle, meeting each rider's eyes. We don't fold. We protect our own. The riders answered with quiet nods, the kind of agreement that doesn't need cheering to be ironclad. One, a former paralegal, offered to handle filings and city paperwork. Another promised financial backing for legal fees. A third suggested rallying other neighborhoods and charities they'd helped. The plan formed like steel, cooling into shape, practical, strong, and unshakable. Claire arrived midway through the meeting, a folder under her arm and determination in her eyes. We'll make our case public, she said. Petitions, letters of support from the hospital, signatures from every neighbor who's shared cocoa around the bonfire. They can't call this a nuisance when the whole community is behind it. Her voice carried a quiet fire that made even the seasoned riders straighten in respect. Outside, snow began to fall in soft, steady flakes. Ben looked through the open garage door at the houses beyond. Lights glowed in windows where once there had only been darkness. It struck him that this wasn't just about motorcycles or music. It was about the life that had returned to these homes, the children who laughed under string lights, the parents who had rediscovered their neighbors, the sense of belonging that had grown from a single act of roadside compassion. In the days that followed, the neighborhood proved Claire right. Families signed petitions and shared their own stories of how the rides and festivals had healed old rifts. Lily helped hand out flyers after school, her small mittened hands pressing each one into her friend's palms as if she were passing along a secret worth guarding. Even people who had once watched from behind curtains stepped forward to speak at meetings, their voices steady with unexpected courage. Ben still felt the weight of the fight ahead, but it was different now. The anxiety that once isolated him became a shared resolve. What began with a single jacket on a frozen road had become something no developer could bulldoze, a living community bound not by contracts or property lines, but by the kind of loyalty that can outlast any storm. The hearing began under harsh fluorescent lights that made everything feel colder than the winter outside. Ben sat near the back with Grant, Claire, and a group of riders who had traded their leather for clean jackets and serious faces. The city council chamber buzzed with tension. Developers in tailored suits shuffled papers and whispered to their lawyers, while neighbors filled every seat and spilled into the aisles, clutching petitions and thermoses of coffee. Lily sat between Ben and Claire, her small mittened hands resting on a stack of signatures she had helped collect after school. Hours passed. The developers spoke first, their voices smooth and practiced. They talked of economic growth and rising property values, of new high-rises that would bring jobs and modern beauty to what they called a sleepy district. Charts and graphs flickered across a screen, all numbers and projections, no warmth. Each argument landed like a cold drop of water. When the council invited public testimony, the room shifted. Parents described how the riders had repaired their cars for free and delivered groceries during winter storms. A nurse from the Children's Hospital explained how donations from the rides had funded a new playroom for patients. Elderly neighbors told of lonely winters transformed by bonfires and music. Their words carried no polish, but they filled the chamber with a steady, undeniable humanity. Ben listened, heart pounding. He hadn't planned to speak. He wasn't a man for podiums or speeches, but when the council chair asked if anyone else wished to address the hearing, something inside him rose like a tide. Grant gave a small nod of encouragement, and Lily squeezed his hand. Ben stood and walked to the microphone. The room quieted. He looked out at the rows of faces, neighbors, riders, officials, strangers, and began in the same voice he used to read Lily bedtime stories. One night last winter, I was driving home from work. I saw a woman stranded on the side of the road in the cold. I gave her my jacket and stayed until help came. I didn't know her name. I just knew she was cold. He let the words settle, then continued. The next morning, 100 motorcycles came down my street. They didn't come to make noise. They came to say thank you, and together we built something I never expected. Food drives, free mechanic workshops, a place where neighbors talk and kids laugh. None of this started with money. It started with kindness. He didn't raise his voice or wave his hands. He simply told the story, a freezing night, a borrowed jacket, gratitude that turned into action. The chamber seemed to lean closer with each sentence. Even the developers sat still, their charts forgotten. By the time Ben stepped back, the silence was thick and complete, deeper than any applause. The council members conferred in low tones, papers shuffling, a few quick glances passing between them. The wait felt endless, though only minutes ticked by. Finally, the chair cleared his throat and announced the decision. The garage and its gatherings would be protected as a community landmark. The writers' festivals, the bonfires, the free workshops, all would continue with the city's full support. The room erupted. Cheers and relieved laughter filled the chamber, echoing off the high ceiling. Grant crossed the space in 2 strides and clasped Ben's hand in a grip that was half handshake, half embrace. "You did it," he said, voice rough with pride. Claire hugged Lily, who clapped so hard her mittens muffled the sound. Outside, winter stars glittered above the city. Their breath rose in clouds that caught the street lights like faint halos. Lily looked up at her father, eyes bright. "We kept our home," she whispered. Ben pulled her close, feeling the weight of the night ease into something luminous. He understood in that moment that home was not the garage walls or the house behind them. It was the heartbeat of people who refused to let kindness be bulldozed, a warmth stronger than any winter and wider than any map. The morning of the festival dawned with a clarity that felt like a reward, sunlight pouring over rooftops, the air brisk but softened by the promise of celebration. From early hours, the street hummed with preparation. Riders arrived in waves, their bikes glittering under ribbons and streamers that children had tied on with mittened hands. Bright paper flags fluttered from handlebars, and chalk drawings of hearts and motorcycles began to appear on the pavement as little artists claimed their space. The scent of barbecue smoke and fresh bread drifted out of open windows, mixing with the low thrum of tuning guitars. By afternoon, the neighborhood had become a living stage. Local bands set up on flatbed trucks, testing microphones with chords that rang like invitations. Food stands lined the sidewalks, serving everything from homemade chili to pastries stacked high with powdered sugar. The once quiet block, known mostly for silence and drawn curtains, was alive with music, color, and the warm clatter of voices. Children darted between bikes, their laughter weaving through the steady backbeat of drums and the sweet brass of a trumpet warming up. Claire worked in quiet focus near the garage wall, unveiling the newest mural she had spent weeks creating. As the tarp dropped, a collective hush spread across the crowd. The painting glowed with winter blues and silver, a lone figure offering a jacket beneath a storm of swirling snow, while a constellation of motorcycles blazed in the distance like patient guardians. It wasn't just art, it was memory captured in light and motion. Gasps turned to applause that rolled down the street like another kind of music. Ben felt the sound vibrate through him, every cheer a reminder of how far a single night of compassion had traveled. He stood with Lily perched high on his shoulders, her small fingers threading through his hair. From that height she pointed out every new detail, the mural's hidden stars, the bikes dressed like carnival floats, the neighbors who only months ago had been strangers, now dancing with riders to a bluesy rhythm. Ben barely spoke. He just let it wash over him, the clapping, the scent of grilled corn, the feel of Lily's weight against him. When the music paused, Grant stepped onto a small, makeshift stage near the bonfire pit. The crowd quieted as he raised a hand, his silver hair catching the late afternoon sun. "We came here first to say thank you," he began, voice carrying with natural authority. "But you all turned that thank you into something bigger. Proof that a single act of kindness can light a flame no storm can put out." His words were brief, almost spare, but the truth in them didn't need embellishment. Then the music returned, louder, freer, almost defiant. Couples spun beneath strings of white lights. Children raced around the bonfire, their ribbons trailing like comets. Neighbors who once exchanged only polite nods now clapped in rhythm together, arms around shoulders, faces shining in the glow of shared purpose. Even the cold seemed to retreat, replaced by a collective warmth that needed no explanation. Ben stayed where he was, Lily still on his shoulders, and took it in. The garage walls now told their story in color. The street, once a corridor of locked doors, pulsed with life. He thought of the night he stopped on the roadside with nothing but a jacket to give, and marveled at how that simple choice had led here, to music and murals, to friendships and open doors. The festival wasn't a victory party, he realized. It was a living declaration that kindness once sparked doesn't flicker out. It grows, it gathers people, and it keeps burning until the ordinary street where it began feels like a beacon in the dark. The first pale light of morning spilled over the rooftops, painting the street in soft gold. Ben stepped onto the porch with a steaming cup of coffee, the air cool and gentle against his face. The world was still, but not silent. From somewhere beyond the houses came a distant, familiar vibration, a low hum that hinted at engines waking, a promise of movement waiting to begin. He stood there for a long moment, letting the quiet settle inside him, remembering how different this street had once felt. Months ago, it had been a place of drawn curtains and quick nods, where each family lived inside its own small world. Now gardens bloomed in front yards where weeds once grew. Children's chalk drawings streaked the sidewalks with bursts of color. The murals Claire had painted on the garage walls caught the early light and glowed softly, like a story the neighborhood never wanted to forget. Behind him, the front door opened with a quick creak, and Lily bounded out, helmet tucked under her arm, eyes bright with the restless joy of a new ride. "They're coming," she said, grinning, as if she could already see the motorcycles rounding the corner. Ben smiled, feeling the rush of her excitement as if it were his own. He reached down to ruffle her hair, grateful for the way she had grown into these gatherings, fearless, curious, unafraid to meet the world as it came. A moment later, the low hum swelled, joined by the deep-throated rumble of many bikes moving as one. Grant and Claire appeared at the end of the street, their arrival as natural now as sunrise. They dismounted with easy grace, smiling like family who had simply come home. Grant's silver-streaked hair caught the morning light as he clasped Ben's hand in a greeting that was more like an embrace. Claire held a basket of fresh muffins and a thermos of coffee, her laughter ringing like a small bell as she knelt to hug Lily. The sight of them, no longer visitors but part of the fabric of the neighborhood, brought a warmth to Ben that had nothing to do with the coffee in his hands. As neighbors began to step outside, waving to one another and greeting the riders, Ben let his eyes travel down the street. There were children chalking new murals on the pavement, parents tending early garden beds, and couples carrying folding chairs toward the garage where today's route would begin. He took it all in, the hum of engines mixing with birdsong, the smell of soil and warm bread from a nearby oven, the gentle laughter of people who had once been strangers, and felt a gratitude so deep it was almost stillness. He thought back to that frozen highway, to the single choice that had started everything. One jacket, one act of care with no expectation of return. From that moment had come bonfires and charity rides, music and murals, a community reborn around the simple idea that kindness could be stronger than fear or profit. What had once been a solitary life, defined by long work hours and quiet grief, had widened into something vast and alive. Lily tugged at his sleeve, eager to join the formation of bikes, now gathering like a living heartbeat at the end of the block. Ben set his coffee down and fastened her helmet, meeting her shining eyes with a smile. "Ready?" he asked. She nodded, the joy in her answer carried in the bounce of her step. As Grant called out the day's route and the engine swelled into a unified roar, Ben felt no trace of the small, cautious life he had once led. He wasn't just a single dad anymore. He was a builder of communities, a keeper of promises, and living proof that the smallest warmth on the coldest night can set the world on fire in the best possible way. Ahead lay open roads and endless possibilities, and he stepped toward them with the quiet certainty of a man who finally knew the shape of home. If this story moved you, share where you're watching from in the comments and hit subscribe, because tomorrow's story is already on the road, and you won't want to miss where the next ride leads.